Lion Roar PT1. Amazing meal, Sirius. Remus Lupin said, folding his napkin after wiping his mouth of any remnants of food. When did you learn to cook so well? Since he's been cohabitating with women of particular tastes. Amelia Bones smiled up at Sirius, who was clearing the table. Susan and I could only tolerate stew for so long. Maybe he thinks by preparing such fine meals for you, he might be able to get into your knickers. Tonks grinned at her former boss. Remus snorted as Sirius looked offended. It can't hurt his chances. Amelia grinned, and Sirius turned a rather stern glare at Amelia and Tonks, though the effect was ruined by the spark in his eyes. Keep it up, you two, and there'll be no pudding for you. Sirius spoke threateningly. Oh come now, Amelia smiled, looking over her shoulder at Sirius and winking flirtatiously. Would you truly deny me something sweet and warm? My dear Amelia, if I were ever permitted to indulge your desires, I would open your eyes to a whole world of pleasure that you never could imagine existed. My dear Sirius, Amelia smiled as she rose from her seat and caressed the man's cheek softly. If I were to allow you to indulge my desires, you'd likely be too shocked that you'd finish the deed before you disrobed. Tonks fell off her chair, clutching her sides as she cackled madly. Remus was pounding the table, tears falling down his cheeks as he roared with laughter. Sirius could only stare blankly at what had just happened. He couldn't believe what Amelia Bones had just said to him, and in front of others. He still couldn't figure the woman out. She flirted with him so blatantly, but he wasn't ever sure if she meant any of it. Many was the night that he thanks the gods for cold showers. Sirius finally grimaced, and turned away, while Amelia kept smiling. Oh how I love flirting with that man. She grinned softly, returning to her seat. You're going to give him a complex one day. Tonks said from the floor, where she was now gasping for breath. Maybe, but I think he's tough enough to take it. Besides, he's a good man under all his bravado. Tonks' head came up and she eyed her former boss suspiciously. Are you saying you might let him into your bed one day? Amelia merely shrugged noncommittally and Tonks covered her mouth with her hand in awe at Amelia's candor. She had really been getting to know the woman over the last few months ever since her escape from death, and she was truly coming to love the woman. She was a truly remarkable person. Bed, kitchen counter, in front of the fireplace, on the beach at sunset. Amelia laughed at Tonks' look of pure awe. The fact is that no one can truly see into the future, and this war can't last forever. Who knows what might happen? Have we heard anything from Shacklebolt or any of our other agents lately? Remus asked, trying to turn the conversation though he was still chuckling and wiping at his eyes. He loved Sirius like a brother, and had a deep respect for Amelia Bones. He just didn't want to have to picture the two of them getting more friendly than he'd witnessed over the past few months. Truth was, he could smell their pheromones whenever he came to the Flamel house. Nothing new. The Death Eaters have all but stopped their attacks. Amelia confessed, a puzzled look on her face. I still think that they're preparing for a major assault, and we're clueless as to when. Unfortunately, even if we did know, it would be a bad idea to tip our hand. You heard Snape at the last meeting, he thinks you know who believes Narcissa might have spilled her guts. Which she did. Sirius said, setting a pot of water on the table along with several mugs. Both her and that waste of a son of hers. Too bad they gave us nothing that we didn't already know. I still think that kid should be thrown in prison. He'll pay for his crime. Amelia said soundly. There is no statute of limitations on murder. Dumbledore said it was an accident. Tonks looked confused. He said that the girl wasn't the target, and had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Be that as it may, Amelia looked saddened. The boy still took a life. He has to own up to what he's done. I know he feels terrible over it. I talked to him at length, and he seemed truly remorseful. But he is Lucius Malfoy's son. I hate to say it, but part of me thinks it was all an act. Well, despite that, it's probably a good idea for you to keep a low profile for now anyway. Remus said. The Death Eaters still think you're dead. So long as they think that, it does give us a bit of an advantage. That it does. However, I feel terrible for Susan. She's so lonely, and she can't even write to her friends. The term's almost over, surely we can get one or two of her friends here. Tonks said with hope in her voice. She'd been tutoring and training the young Hufflepuff girl since she'd arrived at Christmas time. Susan Bones had shown a great deal of progress in her studies, and her aunt was sure she would be able to sit her NEWT exams today. If it weren't for the war and the fact that most of the world believed them both dead. I'm afraid letting anyone else know we're alive would be very bad, at least until the war is over. Amelia said sadly. It's completely unfair to her, and I hate it, but what choice do I have? We'll figure something out for her. Sirius said. Harry and the others will be arriving in a few weeks, and that will help. Once there are other teens to hang out with, things will get better for her. We'll even be able to arrange a few trips to the mainland for them. Hello? Sirius. The four adults rose at once and went into the sitting room, to find Bill Weasley standing there looking anxious. I just got word. The Ministry has been taken. Voldemort himself led the fight. There's word the Hogwarts has been taken as well, but we can't get confirmation. Bill looked very worried as he spoke. Sirius guessed that he wanted to storm into the castle and make sure his baby sister was all right. What about Dumbledore? Amelia asked. Surely he wouldn't have let Death Eaters storm the castle? Bill shrugged, unsure what to say. Like I said, we haven't gotten any confirmation. We do know that there are kids showing up in Hogsmeade asking to be flued home. Harry? Sirius asked, his voice turning to steel, and his hand going for his wand. He'd been itching for a fight for a while, but the Death Eaters had been very unwilling. The moment he heard the school was under attack, he could only think about getting to his godson. I don't know. Bill lowered his eyes, trying to hide his own concerns. His youngest and most favorite sibling was still in the school. So far as I know, he hasn't been found. Okay. Amelia said quickly, putting a comforting hand on Sirius' shoulder. She stepped around the man who'd been sheltering her and her niece since Christmas and stood before them all, making sure she caught their eyes. We need to get to Grimmauld Place, and prepare for the worst. Bill, get word to all our operatives and tell them to prepare to go under. If Dumbledore is defeated, we will lose Grimmauld Place. Remus, you and Tonks need to reinforce the wards here before joining us. It's likely that we will have more company here before the night is through. Sirius, you're with me. Amelia turned and ran up the stairs to check on her niece, who was reading in her bedroom. What is it? Susan asked the moment she saw her aunt's face. Since she'd come to the Flamel house, Susan had learned all about the rebellion her aunt was leading, and had often seen Amelia leave to go fight the Death Eaters. Susan had helped on several occasions with wounded, and was sure there would be a place for her in the order upon her 17th birthday in a few weeks. It was difficult to have nearly everything taken away from you and not have a desire to retaliate. She just hoped she could be as brave as her aunt when the time came. Hogwarts has come under attack. The Ministry as well. We're going to Grimmauld Place to prepare for the worst. I need you to stay here until we return. Hannah? Justin? Susan sat bolt upright on her bed, fighting back tears. She hadn't spoken to her best friend or her boyfriend since before the Christmas holiday, and had missed them terribly. Hearing that they were in danger made her heart pound furiously in her chest. "There's been no word yet," Amelia said honestly, and pulled Susan into a tight hug. "Do not let yourself fret over anything until we have the facts. We're all going to headquarters. As soon as I have word, I will call you." Susan nodded against her aunt's shoulder and Amelia released her, and went to leave. Sirius stood in the door, watching the whole scene. He'd become quite fond of Susan in her time here. She was bright, funny, and could hold her own in a battle of wits against him. He hated to see her looking so frightened, but knew there was nothing he could do to help her. Especially since he himself was worried for the young man he thought of as a son. Grimmauld Place was a flurry of activity. Sirius went straight into the large sitting room, which had turned into the information center over the past 2 years. Everything regarding Death Eater movements, identities, people who might become a target. Basically everything scrap of information the Order had was posted haphazardly in this room. Arthur Weasley was busy removing all the lists and notes that had been put up on the walls, while Molly Weasley was assisting Daedalus Diggle with making emergency port keys. "Any word?" Amelia asked as she and Sirius entered. The ministry was overrun in a few moments. "You know who himself led the battle?" Mad-Eye Moody said, stumping forward. "Wounded have already been taken to safe houses." "Why wouldn't he lead the assault on Hogwarts?" Amelia asked, puzzled by the news. "Dumbledore," Arthur Weasley said. "He's never been able to beat him." "That may be true, but there has to be another reason." "I wonder if Malfoy was the only young recruit at Hogwarts," Amelia reasoned. "You think there's another assassin?" Moody cocked an eyebrow. "Another student." "Oh, dear," Molly Weasley said, looking up. "What about the students? What will happen to all those children?" Amelia shook her head in frustration. There were quite a few children that were at risk, and from what Susan had told her, many of them would try and fight the Death Eaters. The image of faceless children lying dead in those hallowed halls turned her stomach. "I'm sure Dumbledore is doing his best to evacuate them all," Arthur said, coming to his wife to comfort her. There came a call for help from the kitchen, and Moody stomped off to find out what was happening. "The wards have fallen," Sirius said suddenly. As a member of the Black family, he was keyed to the wards protecting Grimmauld Place, and he could feel it the moment the protections fell. He swooned on his feet a moment, as it was a rather disorientating sensation. Amelia looked grave as she reached out to steady him. Silence fell heavily around them as everyone understood what it meant. Albus Dumbledore had died. "Okay, listen to me," Amelia said, putting on her most commanding tone. "We have 10 minutes to clean this place up and get out. There's no doubt that Snape will have to give the location of this place up. You all know the plan, so stick with it. Move." Sirius felt his chest tighten. It was as if a lead weight had fallen into his stomach, and it was everything he had to keep from vomiting. Dumbledore was dead, and Harry was still in that school. Sirius tried to comfort himself that Harry had the map he and his own schoolmates had made, and knew that castle better than any other headmaster since the founders themselves. He also reminded himself that Harry had some very good friends who were clever and resourceful. Sirius just knew that Harry was going to be all right in the end. But none of those thoughts could do anything to ease the mounting tension he felt. Unless something major happened, it was likely that the Dark Lord would finally succeed in killing Harry Potter. "Sirius," Moody called from the kitchen. "You'd better get in here." Never had mere words had a stronger effect on Sirius Orion Black than those. His chest constricting with fear, he slowly turned and began making his way into the kitchen where Moody was waiting for him. At least a quarter of the population got out before the Death Eaters managed to close off the tunnels, Francis O'Malley said to Jonathan Greengrass. He had called his friend and associate as soon as he had learned of the attack on Hogwarts. Word was spreading quickly, especially as the escapees got home to report all that had happened. "You're sure they had help from inside?" Jonathan asked. Sarah saw it herself. "Most of the older students from 4th year up," she said. Francis said, rubbing his eyes. "She's still pretty upset. She must have seen something pretty horrible. I don't know what's happening to the ones who didn't escape, but I reckon he'll ransom them or something." "I'm sorry, Jonathan." "Thank you, Frank, let me know if you hear anything else." Jonathan nodded his thanks, and the head in the flu faded away. Jonathan felt his throat constrict a bit as he fought to control his emotions. "Tori?" "Daphne," the voice of his wife sounded faint and weak. Jonathan couldn't make himself turn to look at her. He knew that if he did, he would be unable to control himself, and he needed to be strong right now. At the very least, he felt he would be able to get Tori, his youngest, back. The ruse the Greengrass family had established over Daphne's betrayal was far too good to be able to negotiate her return. "What can we do?" Aurora asked, her shaking hand taking her husband's. "For now, we wait for word. Dumbledore told us that this might happen, and we've prepared. Our daughters are still alive, as far as we know," Jonathan said firmly, finally turning to look into his wife's teary eyes. His heart pounded in his throat now that he saw the anguish on her face. "Our job now is to be patient until we know anything further." Aurora brought her hand to her mouth to keep from sobbing, and Jonathan brought his arms around her, holding her tightly. "I know you're worried, but think about it for a moment. We have two extremely intelligent and feisty daughters. One of them is deeply in love with Harry Potter, and if we know anything about that boy, it's that no matter how dangerous the situation, he and his friends do manage to come out safe. And then there's Tori." Aurora laughed in spite of herself. What else needed to be said about their youngest? The older Astoria got, the more surprised they were that she had been sorted into Slytherin House. She was as cunning and ambitious as any other Slytherin, but she was also outspoken and courageous and unwavering in her beliefs. How she hadn't ended up in Gryffindor always shocked them. On top of that, their youngest daughter had enormous talent with spells, and was always looking up and learning new hexes and curses. The Greengrass parents always assumed it was something to do with sibling rivalry, as Daphne was quite similar. But the girls never boasted or tried to get one over on the other. "I suppose that I should actually fear for the Death Eaters if Tori is still inside." Aurora smiled, wiping at her eyes. "I know that I do." Jonathan smiled softly. "She'll make their lives very difficult for as long as she's able. Now, we'd better make sure we are ready to leave if he decides we don't fit into his grand vision." Aurora spat out. Jonathan could only nod as he turned back to the fire, secretly hoping that his two girls would burst out of it. He knew beyond doubt that Daphne was going to stay at Harry's side. He had seen such devotion in her that it stirred him. He was extremely proud of his eldest. He prayed the gods would watch over her. Tori, on the other hand, was the one he worried over the most. She was not one to be silenced easily. If they were both still within the castle walls, Jonathan Greengrass knew in his heart that he would receive their bodies soon. And when that happened, there would be no force in nature that could stop him from killing every single last one of his followers. Nothing. It had been easier than he had hoped it to be. The Ministry was far too unprepared for a full-scale assault, especially given the time his Death Eaters had been ordered to attack. There was hardly anyone in the Ministry. Scrimgeour had been there, and the Dark Lord had to respect the minister. He hadn't begged, or pleaded. He had simply accepted his fate and died like a real wizard. The campaign at Hogwarts had been equally successful. His Death Eaters had managed to defeat the Aurors, and round up the students. He had heard that a handful of students had been able to escape, including Potter and his friends. The Dark Lord was surprisingly fine with the result, as he hadn't yet been able to solve the problem of his ailing magical core. He would never even allude to it in front of any of his followers, and was having extreme difficulty even admitting it to himself. But he was unsure that he would be able to beat Potter should they met. That problem was about to be remedied this night. Lord Voldemort marched purposefully through the iron gates of the castle that had once been his home. It was now his, at last. "My lord." Snape bowed low before the Dark Lord and waited to be addressed. "Rise, Severus. Tell me, my friend, were you the one to end Dumbledore's life?" The Dark Lord already knew that Severus Snape had not killed his greatest foe. "No, my lord. It was young Theodore not. He was the one who killed the old fool. He is afraid that he failed you, however, as he could not stop Potter from escaping." Snape spoke flatly. "I wish to see the boy at once, before I enter the Great Hall. He awaits you just inside, with a few others. All Slytherins who took up wands against the Aurors," Snape said coolly, turning to walk with his master into the entrance hall. Many of his faithful waited his entrance. Among them stood a few of the new faithful. Standing in front of them, hood down, and mask off, stood Theodore Nott, who looked rather shaken. At once they all knelt reverently before their lord and master. "Please, rise, my faithful. I must tell you how truly pleased I am. Especially you, Theodore. You have done what no one thought possible. You have killed that old Muggle lover, Dumbledore, and paved the way for our kind to move forward." He looked at all of his robed followers, a sadistic smile on his serpentine face. "Many things are about to change, and each of you shall play a major role. Some of you will remain here at the castle to help mold the minds of our next generation. Others of you will fill vital roles in our new ministry. But we haven't the time to discuss all the details right now. It is time I address the students." Lord Voldemort strode up the stairs and into the Great Hall, where his Death Eaters had assembled all of the students and teachers. There was a collective shiver throughout the student body as every single eye was on him. He kept his blazing red eyes upon the head table where the surviving teachers stood, each of them being held at one point by members of his inner circle. Voldemort stood before the students and smiled as they all waited for him to address them. He thrilled at the palpable fear that permeated the room, and drank it up like the sweetest ambrosia. "Tonight is the start of a new age for us all." He spoke with the same charm he'd used on teachers and fellow students when he was young. He had been extremely charming and had always managed to get what he wanted through sheer force of will. "Starting this very night, we get rid of antiquated and useless teachings. There will be no more houses, no more separation. You will be taught the most noble beliefs of Salazar Slytherin, and you will become the leaders of my great vision. I intend to weed out any undesirables and wash away any doubt of what it truly means to be of magical blood. Fear not, my young disciples, should you follow me faithfully, you shall receive reward beyond imagination. Do not fear for your teachers, either. I have the deepest respect for them, and they shall continue on, though they will have assistant to aid them in your education. Now, I bid you all good night." The students began to rise when the Dark Lord called their attentions again. "I should very much like to see Miss Amanda Brocklehurst, Miss Cho Chang, Mr. Cormac McLaggen and Mr. Terry Boot. Murmurs broke out among the students, and his Death Eaters stood at the door to make sure those students didn't try to escape, that was, if they hadn't already. After a time, 3 students were brought before him and brought to their knees by the Death Eaters they had been unable to sneak past. "Please, introduce yourself," Voldemort said with a smile. Cormac McLaggen and Terry Boot both did their best to appear proud and defiant. The girl, Cho Chang, couldn't even look at the Dark Lord. "And the 4th?" Voldemort asked. "We believe she managed to escape before the passages were closed, my lord," one of the Death Eaters admitted nervously. "Then we will have to make do with 3. Voldemort said as he looked upon the 3 students he'd chosen above all others to return his power. "Tonight, you will have the great honor of helping your new lord with a rather unique experiment. Should it work as I hope, you shall be remembered for your great sacrifice. Shall we?" The Dark Lord motioned for his Death Eaters to bring the 3 prisoners along to the room that would become exactly what he would need. Tonight, he would finally rid himself of the cursed Potter blood, and his power would be restored. Then, the hunt for Potter was going to be his full priority. It was with a start that Daphne Greengrass awoke. The sun was only starting to rise and its great gold light was beginning to shine into the room. Harry's arms were wrapped protectively around her waist and he was leaning against a wall made of brick. Daphne thought he looked very uncomfortable. As she glanced around, she thought that her other 2 friends looked much more comfortable. Hermione was curled up in the middle of a rather elegant-looking rug with Neville spooning her, his arms around her and his head resting on hers. Despite all their trouble, Neville and Hermione actually looked peaceful. Daphne remembered that Hermione and Neville had become quite intimate. She also remembered how the 2 had been unable to be that close again since the Christmas holiday. Daphne couldn't help but wonder if they had copulated during the night. However, the fact they were still dressed pretty much blew that theory away. Daphne began to pull away from Harry, slowly so as not to wake him, as she doubted he'd slept all that well to begin with. "I take it you're ready to get up," Harry whispered. "I thought you were sleeping," Daphne said softly, reaching up to caress his cheek. "But I have to say, you look terrible. Sleeping against a wall, sitting up while holding your very beautiful, though distraught girlfriend, let's see if you look any better," Harry said as he opened his eyes and kissed Daphne's cheek. "Thank you." Daphne smiled and kissed Harry before finally getting to her feet. She held out a hand for Harry who got to his feet. "Should we wake them?" Daphne whispered, nodding towards Hermione and Neville. "No need," Neville said groggily. "This floor is not as comfortable as it looks." "I don't know," Hermione's voice sounded. "Having you next to me all night certainly made things a bit more pleasant." "Okay, so we're all awake," Harry said quickly. "So I think we need to figure out where we are. And then we should try and get in touch with Sirius." He looked around the small room they had arrived in. It looked as if it were a small study. There were a few shelves of books, and 2 rather comfortable chintz chairs, similar to the ones Harry had seen Dumbledore conjure. His stomach churned a bit as he thought of the headmaster. "Some food might not be a bad idea," Hermione suggested as Neville helped her to her feet. "Good idea." Daphne tried to smile. Okay, Harry smiled, despite his anguish. "Let's find out if there's any food around here, then we'll figure out the rest." As it turned out, there was a fully stocked pantry and icebox in the kitchen, which turned out to be right across the hall from the room they had arrived in. The 4 teens worked together and made eggs and toast. They ate in relative silence, none of them wishing to bring up the events that had led them to find themselves in wherever they were now. Once they finished up their meal, and cleaned up after themselves, they began to explore the house. It was a very nice-looking home, with simple, but comfortable furniture. The sitting room was spacious with a large window looking out on a very lush lawn, and a simple cobblestone street. There were several bedrooms and a medium-sized library. It was the library that the 14s found some of their answers. "I know that church," Harry said as he stared out the window. From that vantage point, he could see the steeple of a church that he recognized almost at once. He turned to his friends. "I think we're in Godric's Hollow." "Why would Dumbledore send us to Godric's Hollow?" Hermione asked. "Maybe he told us in this letter," Daphne said, picking up a sealed envelope with Harry's name written on the front. "Where'd you find this?" Harry asked as he took the letter. "It was here on this desk, along with this stuff." Daphne nodded towards a small pile of items along with Dumbledore's pensieve. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Hermione urged, looking at the envelope in Harry's hands. Harry took a deep breath and broke the seal of the envelope. "Dear Harry, if you are reading this, then I have truly failed and must do what I never wanted to do. I must pass on the task of destroying the remaining Horcruxes and then putting an end to Lord Voldemort once and for all. The task that lies before you now is one that may seem impossible, but I must stress to you that it can be done. I have given you everything I could to prepare for this, including all my notes and memories regarding Voldemort and his Horcruxes. But even better, I have made sure that you are not alone. Your friends will be with you every step of the way, and it is my deepest hope that all has gone according to plan, and as you are reading this, Miss Greengrass, Granger and Davis, as well as Mr. Longbottom are reading over your shoulder." Harry smiled as he felt Daphne's hand on his shoulder, and could hear Hermione's breathing in his ear. "I am sure that you have many questions, and I will try my best to anticipate them here. First, you are in my own home, which I have left to you. It will serve as a very good base of operations for your mission. It is heavily warded, but not by me, as in the event of my death, those protections would fail. I did not send you to Grimmauld Place of the Flamel House for those reasons. Also, Godric's Hollow would be one of the last places that you might be hidden. Lord Voldemort will expect you to show up there, but not to already be hidden there. The flue is not connected, so you will have to use apparition to move about. The backyard will prove to be the best place to do this, as it is covered under the protective enchantments. You and your companions will be unable to access your Gringotts accounts, as I assume that Diagon Alley will be heavily guarded. I have taken care of any monetary needs you might have. I have left all of my wealth to you. There is a magical safe within the study that is password and blood protected. It is keyed to you alone. You will have more than enough for anything you might need. There will be a small leather bag amongst the items where you found this letter. It has been enhanced with extension charms. Inside you will find several notebooks with my many notes and theories on the Horcruxes that I believe Miss Granger and Miss Greengrass will be able to help you to understand. You will also find the Sword of Gryffindor, which you must use to destroy the remaining soul anchors. As we've discussed, there are surprisingly few methods which can destroy such evil. Now, I have one last thing to ask of you. As I have mentioned, I have left you my home and my wealth. I have also left you all of my worldly belongings. I have done this to keep many rather special items out of the clutches of the Death Eaters. It is my wish that when the war has ended that you donate much of my legacy back to Hogwarts or the Ministry for the betterment of our kind. Especially my personal journals. I think that many people would find them informative and mind-opening. Perhaps between the two of us, we might be able to prevent future generations from repeating our own mistakes. I know that you and Professor Snape have had your problems in the past, and I have tried many, many times over the years to get him to explain why he treats you the way he does. Alas, he holds much too tightly to his anger and hatred. Despite his appearances, he is truly a good man, and I ask that you put aside your personal feelings and trust him. One day perhaps, he will open up to you and you will finally understand what made him the man you know. Harry, you are a very remarkable young man, and I know that I am better for knowing you. I know that I will never be able to correct all the mistakes I made with you, but I hope that now, you at least understand why I chose to act the way I did. It is not forgiveness I ask, but only understanding. Trust in your friends. They have chosen to follow you because they believe in you. You are a natural leader. Use this. Voldemort fears you, just as the rest of the country fears him. Use that as well. Remember that your ability to love, to forgive, and to inspire are your most powerful weapons. They are the powers that he knows not. I have come to the end of my journey in this world, but yours has just begun. Good luck and farewell, my friend. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Harry slowly folded the letter back and slipped it back into the envelope. Silence reigned over the Four Tens for a few moments while they all silently grieved for their fallen headmaster. Inside, Harry felt something stirring within him, something powerful that he couldn't really remember feeling before. It was filling him with determination. Too many people had died trying to oppose the Dark Lord. Too many children had been robbed of having known their parents, and too many parents had lost children. Many more would die so long as Tom Marvolo Riddle was alive. This was no longer acceptable. We have a lot to do. Harry spoke softly, turning to face his friends. He strode over to the small table where Daphne had discovered the letter. He picked up the leather bag and reached inside to pull out several notebooks. He handed them to Daphne. I want you and Hermione to start going over these. We need to figure out exactly what Horcruxes are left. We need to know what they are, and where they might be located. What about the fake? Hermione asked. Harry reached into his pocket to pull out the fake locket he had gotten out of that cave the night before. Now that he saw it in the light, he couldn't help feel that it seemed familiar to him, though he couldn't think why. The only thing we have to go on is the initials. I don't think we have the resources to discover who RAB might be. So for now, let's try and figure out what the others might be and where. What about me? Neville asked as Hermione and Daphne began to settle themselves in and started looking through the notebooks. You and I are going to try and figure out what exactly we have in this house, and then figure out what might be useful and what's pointless to us. Then we need to figure out how we can contact the Order, and learn what's happening out there. We won't be able to make any plans if we're blind to what's going on in the world. Neville nodded and he and Harry left the library to really explore the house. They found the remainder of Dumbledore's possessions in the attic, all neatly packed and catalogued. Apparently the old man had been preparing for his death for a long time. Most of what had been packed looked to be useless to them, though there were quite a few potion ingredients, some of them quite rare. Harry and Neville brought everything that was related to potions out of the attic and into the library where the girls were still sitting, though in the 2 hours they had been gone. The girls had accumulated quite a stack of notes. Anything? Harry asked. Yes. Daphne said brightly. Dumbledore was quite meticulous with his notes. He had a full list of potential Horcruxes, and even crossed off ones that were destroyed. She said, pointing to a list the headmaster had made. Harry took the leather-bound journal and read. A diary, destroyed. The Ring of Slytherin, destroyed. The Locket of Slytherin. The Cup of Hufflepuff. The Gauntlet of Gryffindor, in Goblin possession. The Diadem of Ravenclaw, destroyed. The ring of Ravenclaw. The star pendant of Ravenclaw. The serpent, with Voldemort. Harry Potter, destroyed. He thought I was a Horcrux. Harry asked softly. Yes. But don't you remember what happened last summer? Hermione asked. He got it out of you. Daphne reminded him. And he said it wasn't a Horcrux because you hadn't gone through the ritual that makes a Horcrux. Neville added. Harry nodded as he remembered the discussions with the old headmaster. So, the serpent will most likely be the last one we get to. Harry reasoned. I can't imagine being able to get to it without having to face him. So we need to figure out which of these things are the real Horcruxes, and where they might be. I think that we're going to have to speak to the goblins. Daphne said. And possibly my mother. She's kind of an expert on Rowena Ravenclaw. She might know what happened to the pendant and the ring. We can't risk a letter. Neville said. Maybe we can. I thought I heard Fawkes last night. Harry said. It's possible, but I think it's unlikely. Hermione said sadly. Fawkes was Dumbledore's familiar, and phoenixes rarely ever bond with humans. We can try to call him, but I think we should figure another way to contact people. Harry nodded, thinking hard, then a smile broke out on his face. What's on your mind, Harry? Daphne said, feeling a bit of a chill at her boyfriend's smile. Dobby. There was a soft pop, and the 4 teens turned to see the house elf standing shakily behind them. Both his ears were bandaged and he was holding his arm awkwardly. There were a few long cuts that looked fairly nasty, even thought they were dried and beginning to scab over. Harry Potter, Sir Dobby is so pleased to see you are safe. Dobby, what happened to you? Harry asked, kneeling in front of the little elf. Dobby is being punished for trying to help students escape. Dobby was about to be punished when Harry Potter is calling for him. Harry Potter has saved Dobby again. Why did you come when Harry called you? Daphne asked, looking suspicious. Have you bonded with House Potter? Harry's eyes bugged out and he turned to Daphne, who was still watching the elf shuffle his feet. No. Dobby said softly. Dobby wishes to serve the noble House of Potter, but is too afraid to ask to be allowed. Dobby promised he would serve the great Harry Potter should he ask, even without being bonded. Harry, can I speak to you for a moment? Daphne asked. Harry stood, while Hermione knelt in his place to get a good look at the weak-looking elf. Harry, I know how you feel about servants and all that, but you might consider allowing Dobby to bond with you. He's obviously willing to put himself at risk just trying to uphold your beliefs. He was trying to help kids escape. If you let him bond with you, his magic will strengthen. And he'll be able to do things for us that we're unable to, like set up meetings with the goblins outside of Gringotts or find and relay messages to the Order. But can't he do that without bonding? No. The goblins won't acknowledge him without the bond. Daphne said pointedly. Hermione's not going to like this. She will if Dobby ends up saving our arses at some point. Harry knew that Daphne had a point, and kissed her softly. Dobby, would you do me the honor of serving my house and my family? Dobby's big green eyes grew in size and he began nodding slowly in awe. He very slowly stepped forward and bowed before Harry. Dobby pledges his life willingly to the great House of Potter. Dobby held out a hand, and Harry took it and felt a tingling sensation run up his arm. Dobby looked up with tears in his eyes. Right before Harry's eyes, Dobby's cuts began to heal and Dobby began to look much healthier than Harry had ever seen the elf. I'm guessing you weren't treated well by your former family, Daphne said, and Dobby shook his head as he wiped at his eyes. The Malfoy family was very unkind to Dobby. Wait, I thought you couldn't speak ill of your family. Harry looked confused. Dobby is not bound to the Malfoys and can speak his mind on them now. What would you have Dobby do, Master? First, never, ever call me Master. Harry smiled, placing a hand on his smallest friend. Second, I need you to find my godfather, Sirius Black. He'll likely be at the Flamel house. I need you to let him know that we're alive and that I need a way to speak to him. Tell him all my things were left at Hogwarts. Dobby can retrieve Harry Potter's belongings. Dobby can get all of your belongings and bring them here. But, you might get caught again. Hermione began to argue, but Dobby turned to her, a wide smile on his face. Dobby is a very clever elf, and feels stronger than he has since he was a youngling. Dobby can do it, should they still be intact. Death Eaters were destroying many things in the castle. Dobby, don't worry about that stuff. Neville said. There's just things and can be replaced. Harry agreed with Neville, except for the photo album that Hagrid had given him, filled with photos of his parents. He sadly nodded his agreement. Don't worry about out trunks or anything like that. Daphne said, her arm sliding around Harry's waist. They're right, Dobby. Just get that message to Sirius, then we can figure out what we should do next. There'll be plenty of things for you to be doing. Harry noticed Hermione's look of displeasure, and Harry smiled to himself. We'll also discuss your wages later as well. Hermione's smile made Harry grin wider. Dobby nodded and with a soft pop, disappeared. So what do we do now? Daphne asked Harry. Well, we're in a war. A war that we're losing, but that's going to change right now. To fight a war, we're going to need an army. I think it's about time we raised one. Build an army. Hermione said flatly as if she hadn't heard her best friend correctly. Harry was still smiling at them all as if building an army would be the easiest thing in the world. Daphne found the Mischievous smirk rather infectious, and began to smile in turn. How exactly do you propose we do that? I don't know if you've noticed, but we're more or less isolated here. She asked. Voldemort's going to make it difficult to recruit people to our cause. Neville remarked. People are afraid, and after last night, they'll be too terrified to do anything but run. No one in England's going to fight with us. Then we'll go abroad and recruit help. Harry said flatly, turning back to his friends. I've been told more than a few times I should use my fame. I think it's time to do that. We'll contact Victor and Fleur and see if they can at least point us in the right direction. If we can get the French and Bulgarian ministries on our side, then we might be able to inspire our own people to stand up. A few good strikes against Death Eaters might help that as well. Daphne remarked. It might not be bad to try and offer some kind of olive branch to the goblins. If we can show them that not all wizards are prejudiced, narrow-minded, greedy arseholes. Daphne. Hermione looked affronted, which only made Daphne grin. They might be willing to lend us a hand. I think we should wait on that until we see how they help us with the Horcrux. The goblins prefer to stay out of our affairs. So unless Voldemort tries to subjugate them, they may just rather remain neutral. Neville said as he took a seat and resting his head hands. We need to find a way to keep abreast of what's going on out there. He nodded towards the window. It would be really stupid to try and make plans with no information about what he's doing. Harry nodded. And how do we contact these people? Hermione asked, still unconvinced. She folded her arms over her chest as she eyed each of them. If you send out Hedwig, she'll be followed, or worse. and it'll be incredibly difficult for us to get out of the country right now. We'll use Dobby to send messages. He should be able to apparate. You're going to make Dobby apparate thousands of miles to deliver messages. What do you suggest, Hermione? Harry snapped. Should we do nothing? Hide out here and hope it all goes away. Hermione looked like she wanted to argue, but bit back her retort. Neville came up behind her and rested a hand on her shoulder. She turned to look into his big brown eyes, and felt her chest tighten as he smiled gently. What's wrong, love? He asked softly. He knew that she wasn't trying to throw a wrench in Harry's plans, but that something else was going on in that big brain of hers. She started to say, her voice shaking a bit. I'm afraid of what's going to happen to us. It's all real now. We've trained for it, of course, but we never actually had to. She said, her hand covering her mouth as tears began to fall from her eyes. Kill? Harry asked, all anger vanished from his voice. Hermione nodded and Neville held her to his chest. Of the four of us, only Neville and I have actually taken lives. And both times, it was a life or death situation. 3 times. Neville said softly. Everyone looked at him suddenly and he shrugged. Robespierre Lestrange cornered me in the castle last night. He took my wand but didn't check my pockets. I kind of stabbed him in the throat. Wow. Daphne sighed, as she sat down again, staring at Neville. Rodolphus is really going to be out for your blood now. He'll be the last of his line. They started this feud by torturing my parents. Neville reminded them. This is what I mean. Hermione said, sniffling. Are we just going to become soulless killers? I don't want to take anyone's life if I have a choice. Harry said quickly. I didn't want to do it. Neville said. But if I hadn't, he would have killed me. It's war, love. People die in war. We're going to do what we have to do in order to survive and to protect people who can't protect themselves. He's right. Daphne said. If it comes down to protecting the people I love or a bunch of wonkers who have no regard for human life, my choice is clear. Unless one of you has the gift of sight that you haven't told me about, none of us can see into the future. Harry said, staring at them all in turn. But I do know that at some point we're going to have to do things we'll regret later on. But so long as we're together, keeping each other sane, we're going to make it through this war. We just have to remember what it is we're fighting for. Our future, and the future of our children. Daphne stood and hugged Harry while Neville gave Hermione a reassuring squeeze. Whatever you think we should do, I'm with you. Hermione said, wiping her eyes. But we can't forget our priority. Hermione pointed out. The only way to end this once and for all is to find the remaining Horcruxes and get rid of them. I think we're all in agreement there. Daphne said. So what's first? Neville asked. Well, since we're going to be living here, we should get settled and claim bedrooms. It looked as if there's enough for us to have our own. Hermione blushed a bit and looked at Neville, who was staring at the notebook before him. Harry had a sneaking feeling that there would be one empty bedroom. He completely missed his own girlfriend's questioning look. We can worry about that later. Harry smiled. We should maybe think about lunch. Once Dobby returns we can figure out what we should do next. Hermione nodded and took Neville by the hand and led him downstairs. Harry was about to follow when Daphne held him back. Harry, I don't want to be alone. Would it be all right if we? Daphne started to ask. She was clearly nervous, and Harry understood, because he felt very nervous all of a sudden. Yeah, Of course, he said, answering her unasked question. Daphne's face brightened and she hugged him tightly. Harry didn't really want to be alone either. With Daphne close to him, it might help to keep his mind imagining horrible things that might be happening to the people he cared for. I could hardly sleep last night. Daphne sighed against his chest. I kept dreaming about Tori and Tracy. I don't want to admit to myself that they're gone. We don't know anything for sure. Harry tried to say, but Daphne began shaking her head. You weren't there, Harry. I know. But I know how strong and resourceful both Tracy and Astoria are. I've seen them both fight. If they were together, I can't help but think that they found another way out. We have to keep up hope for them until we know for sure. I never thought that we'd be this cut off from the world. We won't be for long. Harry smiled. Once Dobby gets back, we'll be able to find out exactly what's going on out there. Lord Voldemort stared at the 3 lifeless bodies that were lying at his feet. 2 males and a female. They had been his hope to resolve the problem with his waning power. It hadn't worked. He had wasted months on Rhea. He stood in the large silver tub he had conjured to hold the blood of his young victims. He had followed the ritual to the letter. He had drawn the runes upon the floor in dragon's blood. He carved the corresponding runes into the flesh of his intended victims while reciting the incantation. Then he had stripped his robes, opened his own veins to empty himself of the tainted Potter blood, while levitating his victims and spilling their blood onto him. The ritual had worked. He had cleaned himself of what he had felt was tainted blood once and for all and taken in new, young, powerful new blood. But his magic had not regained its former level. Anger like had never felt ran through him like the new blood in his veins. If it was not the blood that was the problem, then what could it possibly be? What was worse, was that if the blood was not the problem, then he had just relinquished the protections Potter's blood had allotted him. He felt as if he were now more vulnerable than he'd ever been. However, there was no other options left to him. He had felt no further drains on his power, but he could not risk it happening again. He would have to use subterfuge to keep anyone from learning of his weakened state, though he was sure that he was still far more powerful than any other. He was not what he had been. Fortunately, he had spent many years cultivating fear as a weapon. It still thrilled him to see people cower at the sight of him. Even his most faithful and powerful followers could not look him in the eye without a shiver of fear. There was nothing to match the power he wielded with fear. Not even Dumbledore's belief that love was the most powerful and least understood of all magic. He had never seen anything to show him that love held any power at all. It was a useless and wasted emotion. Lord Voldemort thought briefly of his weak mother, the witch who had died giving birth to him, and left him to rot in a Muggle orphanage. If love was truly as powerful as Dumbledore had believed, why hadn't she lived? Voldemort pushed those thoughts out of his mind. There was no need to waste his time contemplating his parentage. So far as he was concerned, he was born of magic to lead the wizarding world to its rightful place as rulers of the world. And now that Dumbledore was dead, there was only one further threat to his glorious vision. Harry Potter. He had already freed his followers from Azkaban, as well as quite a few more prisoners, all of whom had pledged their loyalty to him. Those new followers were being sent to key places in the country where Harry Potter and his friends might appear. Their orders were clear. Capture Potter by any means necessary, but take him alive. His friends were useless. The Dark Lord slipped into his rooms, not even bothering to clean the blood from his skin. He had no more time to solve the riddle of his lost power. It would have to wait for now. There was much to do at the moment. How are the refugees? Sirius asked as Amelia joined him on the porch. He hadn't slept at all since they had first heard of the Death Eater's siege. Amelia handed him a cup of tea, which he sipped gratefully. Sleeping. Arthur slipped some sleep potion into Molly's tea. She was really upset. Amelia Bones said, leaning against the porch railing so she could look at Sirius' face. He had never regained the handsomeness he had once had, but he was still very attractive, especially when one took into account his 12 years in Azkaban. I can't blame her. I imagine she's not alone. I still don't understand why he kept them all. It's not for ransom. Amelia sighed. He's even allowing families to write to their children. Then I think that the only other possibility is that he's going to re-educate them. Sirius said, turning to look at Amelia, who was clearly upset by that thought. He's going to make them into a new army. And we don't have the manpower to attempt to fight him. Not to mention what he might do to the children. What do you think he'll do to the Muggleborns? Sirius pondered. Given his distaste for them, what do you reckon? Practice dummies for the rest to perfect their curses and hexes. Amelia shivered as she imagined some poor faceless first year strung up with a line of students waiting to test out their spell work on him. Sirius noticed her shudder, and took her hand. Be thankful that Susan wasn't there. She's safe. I am. I wish we could save them all. None of them deserve that sort of thing. Sirius nodded, and turned back towards the forest that hid the seashore. It was as if he were watching for something, or more specifically someone to come through those trees at any minute. You know he's all right, don't you? Amelia asked, looking up into his dark eyes. Sirius smiled softly and nodded ever so gently. I do. If he'd been in the castle, we'd have heard about it by now. Voldemort is nothing if not dramatic. He'd want the whole world to know how he managed to kill a 16-year-old boy. He'd probably have Harry's corpse tied to the gates of Hogwarts. That's pretty grim, even for you. Amelia made a face. But it's true. We both know it is. We should have waited to cast the new Fidelius. Harry might have been trying to get here. Now we have no idea where he might be. I told you already. We'll wait a few days, and if no one's tried to get Grimmauld Place, we'll have Bill Weasley cast a new Fidelius charm. We've also got plenty of people out there keeping their eyes open. He'll turn up at some point. Sirius nodded once again, and Amelia gave him a tight hug. People are looking up to you. I can't have my right hand falling to pieces on me. Your right hand? Sirius quipped. Amelia pulled away, a look of determination on her face as she began to speak. There's a reason I always have you backing me up when we go out. You're a strong fighter, and I know that no matter what, you'll do what needs to be done to protect me. Spending time with you over the past few months has been good for me. It's opened my eyes to a lot of things, including things I've missed because of my work. You've become more than a friend to me. Sirius's smile faded a bit as Amelia opened her heart to him. I never believed you were the one to betray the Potters. Even when I arrived at that street and saw what had happened. None of it made any sense to me. You were one of the best Aurors in the Corp. You were on track to break Mad Eye's arrest record. You were a lot of things, Sirius Black, but a killer was not one of them. Thank you. Sirius smiled again. Thank you. Amelia replied. With a smile, she pulled him closer and placed a gentle but firm kiss on the old dog's lips. Sirius was stunned for a moment at the gesture, but as Amelia lengthened the kiss, he began to relax into her arms, and allowed the kiss to deepen. It had been a very long time since he had felt a woman's lips upon his own, and it was just as amazing as he had remembered it to be. Amelia reveled in his taste. She didn't care that there was 9 years difference in age between them, or that she had been his superior at one time. He had always stood out to her as being a man of integrity, despite his knack for causing chaos. Over the past few months, he had proven beyond a doubt what kind of man he truly was. She knew he would do anything for his godson, and anyone else he cared for. Along with that, he could make her smile, and had awakened something she had thought lost years ago. Her sense of fun. Despite all that was going wrong in their world, he could still make her smile. It was war, and their lives could end the very next day. Amelia Bones was going to be damned if she allowed herself to ignore her growing feelings anymore. She owed it to herself to try and find some piece of joy. Sirius gave her that joy. If they managed to survive this war, then they could figure things out. But for now, she just wanted to live in the moment, with no regrets, and no remorse. Sirius broke the kiss and smiled at her. She stared into his eyes and saw his conflicting emotions. "I promise you, Sirius. We'll find him." Sirius touched his forehead to hers and sighed. "I know. Come on. We could both use a bit of a rest," she said, leading him back into the house. It was late in Dumbledore's house, and the 410s were all beginning to yawn. They had been poring over Dumbledore's extensive notes, trying to discern some clue about which of the items on his list were the actual Horcruxes and where they might be hidden. All they knew for sure was that RAB had made off with the original locket. They couldn't know for sure if it had been destroyed. All that was left was Nagini, Voldemort's serpent, and one other item. They all agreed that it must have once belonged to Helga Hufflepuff or Godric Gryffindor, as they knew the locket belonged to Slytherin, and they had destroyed Ravenclaw's tiara. "We have the sword, so we know that can't be it. That only leaves his gauntlet," Hermione reasoned. She had a biography about Gryffindor opened in front of her where she had found a picture of the gauntlet. They learned that both the gauntlet and the sword had been a gift from the leader of the Goblin Nation for Godric's assistance in a battle against a very vicious dragon. The sword was impervious to anything that might weaken it, and actually would take in anything that might strengthen it. The gauntlet, it turned out, allowed the wearer to fly without the assistance of a broom, and would act as a long-distance porte-carte. One simply had to say their destination and the rather large ruby with their wand. "That'd be really handy in a pinch," Neville said, admiring the picture of the gauntlet. Unlike the sword, the gauntlet disappeared. It was thought to be buried with Godric in Godric's Hollow, but no one knows for sure. Hermione finished reading the passage. "Well, we're in Godric's Hollow, and we could go look for his grave, but how would we know if the gauntlet is there or not?" Harry asked. Silence reigned them for a few moments before Daphne cleared her throat. "Surely Dumbledore checked that for himself," she said, flipping through one of the notebooks again. "If it were there, I doubt it would have been on his list." "That makes sense," Neville said. "Why bother putting it on the list if it were still buried with Gryffindor? If Voldemort had managed to get it, it wouldn't be there when Dumbledore looked." Harry was about to speak when there was a small pop, and a very tired and upset elf stood before them. "Dobby, are you all right?" Harry asked, going quickly to the little elf's side. "Dobby is so very sorry, Harry Potter." Sir Dobby could not find Harry Potter's godfather. Dobby tried and tried, but could not feel his presence. Dobby remembered Harry Potter say he was on an island, but could not find the island. "I told you he was at the..." Harry's mind blanked and he looked to his friends, who all looked similarly puzzled. "Why can't I remember where Sirius is at?" "The Fidelius," Hermione said, her eyes widening. "They must have recast it. We can't remember where Sirius is." Harry's shoulders sagged at the news, but patted Dobby's little shoulder. You did fine, Dobby. Thank you for trying. We'll have to think of something else. Dobby also tried to get Harry Potter's belongings from Hogwarts. We told you not to worry about that stuff, Harry said. Dobby looked pitiful as he began wringing his hands, and shuffling his feet. Dobby thought that Harry Potter and his friends would like to be able to change clothes, and have their things. But Dobby was unable to retrieve them. The Death Eaters had destroyed all the belongings of students who had escaped. Dobby is terribly sorry for disobeying. You have nothing to apologize for, Dobby. It was very kind of you to be thinking of us and trying to take care of us. Harry smiled at his little friend. You should rest up, Dobby, Neville suggested. You're going to have plenty of work over the next few days. Dobby actually looked energized by that, and after Harry told him to get some sleep, the little elf scurried off to rest up. Well, that puts a kink in our plans, Daphne said as Harry rose to his feet. We can send Dobby with a letter to my family tomorrow. At least then we'll get some kind of information. That's a good idea, Hermione agreed. We can also send a letter to my gran. She might have some information we could use. She's pretty well connected in the Wizengamot and the Ministry, Neville offered, forgetting that Daphne's father was on the Ministry as well. Dobby was right. I would like to have something else to wear, Hermione said. They all agreed on that point. We won't be able to do anything until we figure out where these damned things are, Harry said bitterly. Okay, tomorrow, we send messages to Neville and Daphne's families. We'll also get messages to Victor and Fleur and see about getting some kind of network built. We can also see about getting into Muggle London for clothes and supplies. It's getting late, and we're all a bit knackered, Hermione said, taking Neville's hand. We should get some sleep. Good night. Neville couldn't help but give a small grin as his girlfriend led him away. 10 Galleons says it's a few hours before they actually do any sleeping, Daphne said. Harry turned to look at her with a disgusted face which caused her to giggle. I'm so glad we took the room on the other side of the house. I'm glad she's so good at silencing charms, Daphne countered. So how about it? Are you ready to turn in? Harry saw her look away nervously as she asked the question. He was suddenly nervous as well. He couldn't say why. They'd been together a few times now, and each time they had pushed their boundaries a bit further each time. In truth, he desperately wanted to be with her, but he was unsure if this was the proper time. She looked up at him when he didn't answer her question. Harry. I love you, you know that, right? Daphne nodded, her face looking puzzled. I want it to be perfect, when we, you know. Harry. Daphne said, rushing to him and placing her hand over his mouth. I don't want to push you into anything. I don't want to push myself. But we don't have all the time in the world anymore. The world has changed, and people are dying. We could be next, and I don't want to face death not having given myself to you. The man I love. I am asking you to make love to me, not because I'm afraid that we may not ever get the chance, or that we may die, but because I love you and I want you to know just how deeply I love you. She took his face in her hands and pressed her lips to his. When she broke the kiss, she could see his love for her shining in his emerald green eyes. He smiled softly to her and without a word, led her to the bedroom they had claimed as their own. Daphne locked the door behind them, and Harry swished his wand over her head, casting silencing charms. Daphne turned back to Harry and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling herself up to kiss him. He held her waist in his arms, lifting her off the floor. She slinked her legs around his waist as he turned and took her to their bed, where he carefully laid her down. "I love you, Harry Potter," Daphne said when their lips parted. He kissed her quickly before staring into her eyes. "I love you, Daphne Greengrass," he said. She pulled him back to her for another kiss as her hand slipped down his chest to the hem of his shirt and tugging it up. Harry tore his lips away from hers as she pulled his shirt over his head and tossed it behind him. His mouth found the soft supple flesh of her neck and he began to gently trace his lips along her collarbone, eliciting soft moans of pleasure from his lover. Harry began to unbutton Daphne's blouse, his fingers gliding across her soft creamy skin as her fingernails traced along his back. Daphne gasped as Harry's hands ran up her stomach and across her breasts. His fingers curled around the straps of her bra, and pulled them down her shoulders. She felt a charge as Harry's lips sucked softly on her scar. Daphne pushed Harry away, and sat up so she could undo the hooks of her bra before allowing it to slip away from her chest. She then reached out for her boyfriend, and turned him so he fell back on the bed with her straddling him. She bent forward and captured his left earlobe between her teeth, and gently pulled on it, before trailing small kisses down his neck. Harry's hands cupped her breasts, his rough palms doing wonders on her nipples. She hissed in pleasure as he gently tugged on her left nipple as he rose up to nibble at her collarbone. It was one of her most sensitive spots, and Harry loved the noises she made when he kissed her there. While he was occupied with her neck and breasts, Daphne began tugging at his belt, determined to get him out of his jeans. She could feel his excitement and wanted to remove all the barriers between them. She couldn't help but smile to herself as she swore she heard Tracy cheering her on. She had finally gotten his jeans opened when Harry grabbed her waist and flipped her over. Apparently he wanted to have a bit of control for a while, and Daphne was not really willing to give up on her mission. That was until she felt his hands at the waistband of her jeans. It looked as if he wanted the same thing she did. It wasn't long before they were both quite bare. Daphne was once again on top of Harry and was sliding herself along Harry's length. It was truly intoxicating, the pleasure she was getting just from that act, but she wanted more. She bent to kiss him, while grasping her boyfriend and positioning him. Slowly, as she continued kissing Harry, she began to lower herself onto him. She took a deep breath as he pressed into her maidenhead. With a gasp, she had lowered herself, forcing him to break the very last barrier between them. She sank onto him, burying Harry inside of her. She saw him looking terrified and shook her head before he could protest. Tracy and Hermione had both told her about this part. She had expected it. The stinging pain of it. She also knew it was temporary and knew that once she began to move the pain would go away. Still, she felt she had to take a moment. Harry watched Daphne as she lowered herself onto him, and nearly leapt out of bed when she had hissed in pain. It was clear by her expression that she was hurting, but she shook her head before he could do anything. She pressed her palms into his chest to keep him right where he was. At the same time, he couldn't help take stock of what he was feeling. She was so warm, and velvety soft. She was tight around him, but not uncomfortably so. He watched her face as she opened her eyes and stared into his. Slowly, she began to move on him. It was indescribable, the sensations she was giving him. Harry reached up to cup her breasts again as she moved up and then slowly back down on him. She began to almost purr with the waves of pleasure that she was now feeling. Daphne let out a low growl of pleasure as Harry sat up and took her nipple into his mouth and began sliding his tongue across it. She held his head tightly to her chest as she ground against him. Harry tore his mouth away from Daphne's chest and captured her lips, swallowing a long moan of pleasure from Daphne, who was now beginning to speed up her rhythm. She had started to feel something building in her stomach. It was growing as the pleasure intensified. She knew exactly what it was, thanks to listening to her friends talk, and wanted very much to experience it for herself. She could tell that Harry was also approaching his own climax, as he was gripping her waist more and more tightly. Harry suddenly gave out a groan and his hips rose up off the bed, driving his manhood deeper inside of her. She could feel his climax inside of her, and on his third deep thrust, her own orgasm crashed down on her. She threw her head back and her eyes rolled back as she cried out. Her thighs spasmed and she clutched at Harry's chest, trying to keep from falling backward. She fell forward onto his chest, gasping for breath, as he snaked his arms around her waist and held her tightly to him, kissing her face, breathing just as heavily as she was. Her whole body was tingling with sensation and she could still feel him inside of her, though he was beginning to slip out of her as his excitement ebbed away. That was. She tried to speak, even though she could still hardly breathe. Why did we wait so long again? Harry began to laugh as he fully understood what Daphne was talking about. His laugh proved infectious, and Daphne joined in his little giggle fest, kissing him softly. I was trying to be noble and not go further than we were ready to go. He smiled. Daphne kissed him deeply. Thank you, Harry. Thank you for always thinking of me first, and caring about how I feel. I love you. I love you, too. Harry smiled at her, kissing her again. Daphne lay her head on his shoulder, finally catching her breath, and running a hand through Harry's hair. Do you think this is why Voldemort's such an arse? Daphne asked, smiling softly. What? Harry asked, turning to look at her smiling face. Daphne began to laugh again. Maybe if he felt what I just felt, he wouldn't be such a wanker. Maybe if he just made love to someone, he'd loosen up and the war would be over. Daphne was now laughing hard, which caused Harry to laugh all the harder. Maybe, but now that Bellatrix is dead, I think you'll be hard-pressed to any witch willing to make love to that snake-faced bastard. Harry said between fits of laughing. Oh, now I have really disgusting images of the two of them. Daphne's laughter died away as her face soured. Harry was still laughing and kissed her passionately. Maybe I can try and get those out of your head for something more favorable, he said, rolling her onto her back. How are you going to do that? She asked, running her hands up his chest and around his neck. She then felt his manhood pressing into her pelvis, and she grinned. I think I might have a way. He smiled before capturing her lips with his own again. Please like and subscribe.